Any other ideas? 8, 16, 32. It's obviously some kind of multiples, and it's designating the octave in the sound. So if I do same key on the keyboard, obviously the bigger the number, the lower the sound. No ideas? Pipe organ lengths.
Oh,
So that's where that comes from. So it's 8 foot, 16 foot, 32 foot. So you'll see that a lot. I'm going to turn that glide down. So you're going to start to notice at its most basic kind of sound that different waves have different sounds. Now there's other stuff happening here, but try to start thinking about sawtooth sound like this, triangle sound like this, sine wave sounds like this, square wave sounds like this. It has a little graphic picture to kind of give you the idea of what that wave sounds like. But if you remember back to digital audio, and I did one cycle of a wave, and I did this. That was a sine wave, and the wave started, and the wave crossed this 0 point, and it had this positive and negative kind of side to it. And that was our waveform in its easiest form. And then when we recorded in Pro Tools, we had our voice or music that we imported, and it had a much more complicated waveform. The only difference is things with a different waveform are going to sound different. So this isn't going to produce a sine wave, but this one is going to be, it's going to be real normal and clean. And as we get to other wave shapes, they're going to sound different. And there's some big math to why those do that. And it has to do with harmonics and overtones. And I don't want to get too crazy into the physics and the math of it, but I do think that you want to start thinking about that, because as you get into resonance and it being able to create actually oscillation with the resonance of a filter, you can start to then say, I want to have this kind of sound, but I want to also have this other sound in there that I can add to it, and I only have one oscillator. How can I still do that? You want to start thinking about, how do I create that stuff? So sine wave, the purest form of wave, it's just the tone. So if I did a 1,000 hertz tone, it's just 1,000 hertz. There's nothing else to it except for just that sound. But if I play anything, a piano, a guitar, my voice, I have a much more complex wave. I have other frequencies that are making up that sound, not just this pure, simple frequency like we've kind of thought in all the stuff we've done in digital audio. So if we look at square wave, that's actually odd harmonics, but the volume of those harmonics decrease linearly. So what does that mean? Harmonics are multiples of the original frequency. So whole number multiples. So let's just do some math. So if I have a 1,000 hertz tone, sine wave, and I want to add a whole number multiple, 1,000 times 1 is 1,000, so that's the fundamental. 1,000 times 2 is 2,000. Now I have another tone that can play at the same time. But you're like, wait a minute, if I play a 1,000 hertz tone and a 2,000 hertz tone at the same time, they're going to combine to create this sound. But the key of this harmonics is that the volume of that second tone is less. So as we go to those higher and higher harmonics, they become less and less and less and less. And they do that linearly with like a straight fade, the same amount of volume over time, or if we do a fade. So if you think about doing fades in audio programs, it's usually that straight line that's linear, and algorithmically it can be more of a curve. And those are our two choices of how those volumes change. Now that gets really complicated. But what I want you to think of is that each sound that gets created is going to have a certain number of harmonics above it, and each harmonic above that fundamental is going to get softer and softer and softer, but they all combine to make that sound. So if this had pure sawtooth, that has a very different sound than, they have some similarities to them. But you can hear like maybe some buzzy difference to it. There's other stuff happening here because I have can start to identify what those basic building blocks would sound like, you'll start to be able to kind of say, how do I combine them to make the sounds that I want to make? So sine wave is pure, square wave, odd harmonics, but they reduce their volume linearly. Triangle wave, odd harmonics also, but it reduces the volume by what we call the inverse square. So it's just a bigger change over time. It's a different change over time. So if you looked in Pro Tools or in Logic and you did fades on audio regions, you can do a curved fade, and that could be a inverse square of each measurement that's made during that fade, instead of equal fade over equal time. And then sawtooth, all harmonics, even and odd, so not just the fundamentals at 1,000, first harmonic was 2,000, the next harmonic would be 3,000, but that's an odd harmonic because it's times 3. Next one would be 4,000, but it's times 4, so that's an even harmonic. So if you think of how all those sounds stack together and their volumes decreasing, that makes up the sounds that we have. So if I took a sound of a trumpet note and I analyzed all the harmonics versus the sound of a flute note, I would be able to figure out which harmonics actually played in those sounds. And so when people were designing synthesizers, that's what they had. They could analyze sound with oscilloscopes and filters scientifically and say, it's made up of these building blocks of sound. If I want to recreate them, I have to create something that will create these noises. And then put them together or take things away from them to create the sound that I'm looking for. That's kind of how it starts, is to say, I know how this sound is made. I want to recreate it. How do I get there? And then I start building the circuitry to make that work. It's complicated, and I don't think you have to be super knowledgeable about that, but that's what this is. The oscillator creates that sound, and the putting together of different oscillators and the way that those waveforms are produced, or the types of waveforms that are produced, will make up different sounds. If we were going to go and if I was going to say, Austin, you have to create a saxophone sound for me, you'd probably be like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to create a saxophone sound because that's super complex, but I might be able to make like a some crazy sound easier because I can move my filters and things. So I'm not necessarily going to expect that you can create real instruments from these pieces of synthesizers, but I want you to know how to control these parts to do what you want. Nice accidents are great to have, but if I can go, man, I need to have something that does this, or it needs to sustain longer, or I need it to rise and then fall, I need to know how to be able to do that. And you should be able to control the sounds that you want to make when you create them. So that's kind of the goal. So back to here. So oscillator is going to create the sound. We have one oscillator. The sound is produced when I hit the key. And yes, it does produce a different note when I hit a different key, but it's producing the same sound on every key. It's just at a different pitch level. So that one oscillator is hitting or generating that sound as I play. Makes sense so far, right? We want to think about filter. A filter is literally an EQ. So if we look at EQ in any program, this is just a filter. When we talk about what these filters do, they're usually high-pass filters or low-pass filters. They're going to say, allow a certain part of this sound to come through or not come through. And in this case, a low-pass filter is going to say, let all the sound come through. So if we think of this as the frequency spectrum of human hearing, if we take it back to DAO, and we say low hertz are over here and high hertz are over here, it's going to let all the sound come through. And as I lower this, it's going to cut high sounds and only let the lower sounds through. So if I do that, now if I take my resonance down, it will sound more normal. Do you hear how I'm losing the high end? Now I have just very low sounds. Now I have high sounds in there as well. Meaning not pitches, but that one pitch and how that sound is produced, I'm filtering out the EQ of that sound. And that is literally the same thing here. And if we messed around with, here we are. If we messed around with this, I can do the same thing. Because this is the filter. It's just finding a frequency, boosting it or cutting it, and sweeping it. So that's all it's doing at the same time. Now this is doing a little bit different than a low pass or high pass filter. It's more this filter here. We'll take that down. It's more this part of EQ or this band of EQ. And the amount that this dot is away from that center line is the resonance. So if it's very close to the center line, I get very little change. If it's very far from the center line, I'm getting more. So it's amplifying the cutoff frequency where it's currently selected. It's actually emphasizing whatever this is set at the time that things are played. Now, volumes are going to change and these things can move, but if everything was static and I played, that would emphasize the area that I'm at that frequency. Super low, but if I raise up that emphasis, and for you guys that are a little bit more advanced, I'm actually creating with resonance a sine wave around that cutoff frequency, and it's actually becoming an oscillator. Hear that? And then I can do things to that resonance to manipulate it. So I have to generate a sound. I have to filter it. There's our subtractive synthesis. I'm taking away from whatever I just created with this oscillator in this various way. There's some other things that I can do here with filter as well. We'll look at that in a second. And then I have some kind of volume control. In this one, it's really simple. My overall volume is right here. Literally just volume. Hey, I've just been recording for you. I'll just let it run and you can. Yeah. So we have some kind of amplifier that then allows us to control the loudness or softness of the sound at certain points when the sound is made. Let's turn that down a little bit. Volume is still high on this synth, this mono synth, one oscillator. So volume is high, but my decay, because this only has a setting of decay to it. So how long does that sound last? Very percussive. Decay is very short. It's only going to give me a short burst at that volume. As I raise it, I can hold the key down and get more. I'm holding the key down, but the sound just stops. So I have a way to create a sound. I have a way to take away from the sound in this whole area. And then I have a way to control that volume. Now there's always other stuff. And as you get to more and more deeper and deeper synths, it's going to get more and more complicated. So let's just look at a couple of those things. I'm going to change that octave.
What does int stand for on the filter?
This is intensity. So it's going to be the intensity of how this section works. We're going to talk about this one in a second. But so here's
how much the decay and velocity is controlling it.
Exactly. So how the volume is controlling the decay of that cutoff. So it's like an ADSR for the filter, But in this one, there really isn't a DSR. There's just D. So, and for you guys, if anybody else is like, what? We'll get to that because it's not here in this synth, so I'm not really worried about it. But there's two things here that I want to show you. On filter and on amplifier, there's usually a way to say to the computer, as I hit the keys harder or softer, make the differences in these things change. So right now, velocity sensitivity for the filter is off. If I play lightly, that resonance, that cutoff, all that stuff happens at the same. No matter how hard I hit, nothing changes. If I raise that up, there's differences. Sometimes it seems like a backward. Like I play lighter, I get more of the frequency because my cutoff is higher and my resonance is high. So when I play softer in this case, you can hear I'm getting more of that filter sound. When I'm playing harder, I'm actually getting less of that kind of sound. As I crank it, I get less and less. Same thing down here for volume. As I play soft, now it's affecting the volume of that sound. But as I play softer, then it's less, and as I play harder, then it's more. And then overdrive is just a way to distort. We know distortion. So it just takes the overall signal, because we're thinking of our signal flow for this synth to kind of be left to right. So I've done all this stuff to it. Now I'm just overdriving it, giving it more volume, maybe distorting it, making it more buzzy sounding. Also look at my channel strips here in Logic. It's way too loud, so now I'm peaking. So that's something I got to think about too. Does this initial monophonic, so I can only play one. I hold down two keys. It's whichever one the computer senses that I actually played that millisecond faster is the one it's going to play. It can't play two notes. So it's kind of jumping back and forth because I'm a little bit off. Glide over here, this is an extra. You'll see this on a lot of synths. How I get from one note to the other. Sometimes called portamento. It can not only work with pitch, but it can work with filter. It can work with volume. It can do a lot of different things. So what we're going to be able to do is to say in all these synths, generate some sound, filter or change the timbre, we call it, of that sound, work with the volume over time, and then combine those in so many different ways that it just starts to get infinitely confusing, but really, really interesting, because this is going to make some pretty boring sounds. So if you look at the presets for this, bass bleep. It's doing more of a square wave. It has no glide. Cutoff is really low, so I'm going to get very low frequencies. Remember, that's just a filter. It's a low pass filter. It's only passing very low frequencies. It's getting that little... It has velocity sensitivity on the filter, and the resonance has been turned up, so when I play lightly, I don't get much filter. As I play harder, I might get a little bit more to it. Volume has been set, overdrive is low. I have a volume, I have a decay. So actually as I play that, it has a resonance to it. It is holding for a bit of time. Not every note is going to play on the full length of the keyboard either. It could be that it's set to only play at certain points. The other thing you're going to notice is we can control how the sound reacts. When I play the key, will it play the sound every time at the same point in the cycle? Or will it bring me in at different points? If I play more than one key, will it continue the cycle? So it's a little hard because you can't see what I'm doing, but if I play a key and then immediately hold that down but play the next key, it doesn't re-trigger and go boom, boom. It goes through this process, through this volume especially, and takes on that pitch, but continues this cycle of what we've created. It's going to make more sense as we get to to a more complicated synth. Does it make sense? Is anybody lost? Okay, so let's look at the next one then, because we're not going to do much with this one. The next one in Logic is ESE, and it's just same thing.
Boy, it's so tiny.
It's just has more stuff to it. Now, the interface is going to change every time. The look of it, the color of it, some of the names are going to change, but really what happens is exactly the same. And now you can take that oscillator filter volume, when we get to it, envelope, and apply it to any one of the synths that you guys looked at and any one of the synths that you might have in software from any program. They all work exactly the same. So I can choose my wave. Now I have a sawtooth, a square, but this thing also lets me adjust the width of that pulse. So when we change it from a square wave that has two equal pulses to uneven amounts, we call it a pulse. So those pulses now are different, and they're going to have a different sound to them. So just from square to this far pulse is a very different sound.
Does Logic have an oscilloscope?
It does, but, and I usually use, I was trying to use this here. It just doesn't look very good until I get,
So it comes through your mic.
I know I was trying to do it through my mic, so it's, and I'm afraid about like feedback and stuff,
Yeah.
how I'm going to get a loop in there. I don't know if Logic, let's see here. I have an oscillator. I have meters, but I don't think I have like an oscilloscope. Because I'm recording this to have 3 different interfaces in, I don't know if I can get that to show up any better because my input.
So if you run your input in Logic.
Well, but then I can't change that though,
Okay.
because then it'll feed through there and then it'll go through the speakers and then I'll get a feedback loop. I know that would help to see what those sound like.
Yeah.
So again, I have 4/8/16 length of organ pipes, just showing me different octaves, smaller number, higher sound. I have an oscillator that creates a wave. Now I have 3 choices or an infinite choice between the pulse. Now what you won't, the difference here between digital and analog, if you could listen to that pitch, that change in pulse, no, sorry, not pitch, but there'll be, in digital there can't be a smooth transition of sound from here to here. There's steps. Now we may not perceive them at this point as steps, but you're not going to get like you will with a true analog where you can sweep that knob and get infinite numbers of variations on any of these buttons. There's going to be a step to each one of these, especially when you get to that high pass filter, high pass or low pass filter. This will add some things like this vibrato, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, what that's doing. So don't really worry much about that. Filter, cutoff again. Low pass filter. Resonance around the cutoff frequency. Okay. This has attack and release. So before, where we just had kind of decay and overall volume, here we have volume and attack and release. Attack is how the sound starts, how fast or slow. It fades in because my attack is now very slow or very long. Release is when I let go of the key. So it's going to slowly build up. Let go of the key, it's going to slowly release. That's pretty easy to see. At this volume, so this is the maximum volume that this sound can get to. This takes it through that volume. Again, I have velocity sensitivity. I have velocity sensitivity for the filter. And then I have this intensity for this attack and release as it relates to the filter, which is a little bit wonky in this example. And then I have some effects. So if I bring these back down.
Chris, turn off your EQ that you made.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
You turned off the synth.
Oh.
So tiny.
Oh my God. There it is. And now I can't hear anything, and I don't know why. Those things will happen to you. You'll be like, I have no idea what's going on. It's going to be something stupid. So, chorus, which is the idea of chorus, is a millisecond delay with a detuning of the sound. And so then you have a mix of the original and the wet, and that's what a chorus does. So you'll immediately hear like a doubling effect, but it'll be slightly detuned. And that gives it the kind of sound of a chorus. Flanger's more of a millisecond delay. So now I have a deeper chorus, and ensemble gives you more of a detuning, more layers and more detuning. It's just an effect that it's adding on. So you're going to see synths that have all kinds of extra effects on them as well. Are we getting this? Austin, you all right? All right. Let's look at the next one then. ES1. Let's get a little more complicated. I'm going to obviously choose stereo so I can do more stuff. Now this has a lot of stuff. And if you're confused as to, oh my God, how does this work or that work, or go back to those initial ESM and ESE, because those are going to have the exact same things. Now I'm going to cover the top portion, and I'm going to cover the global settings, and we're going to look at ADSR. We're not going to, right now, look at modulation. Oops, I should just go here, because we'll talk about that next week. I want to go without those for right now and see if we can understand what this is going to do. All right, again, oscillator, 2 foot, 4 foot, 8 foot, 16 foot, 32. Now you see the mark for foot. Now I have two oscillators. I have an oscillator with triangle, sawtooth, square, and again that pulse. So as I go through them, let's see if make sure where I am with all these settings here. Let's do this. Let's take these and that down and put that here. And let's take this off because we'll talk about that. Okay.
Sounds like an amp.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, when like you have like a bad connection in an amp, and just like you plug it in, it goes
that, and that's down, and that's up. Okay, so I have, well,
I've heard that's up quite a few
that
times.
there. So square. Come on. Sawtooth. Triangle. And then changing the pulse width of that square or pulse wave. If I looked at it, that difference in that positive and negative cycle of that wave will cause differences in those, in the timbre of that sound. It's not the filter that's creating those changes right now. Now I have a mix slider that takes me between the two oscillators. So what the heck are these differences in these oscillators? This is a normal wave oscillator. This one is a sub-oscillator, not like an LFO, but it will generate some lower tones based on the size of the pipe, the octave that I'm going to be in, below what this oscillator does. So if I set them the same, you perceive that as a lower pulse to it, but it's lower in as its cycle, and that's why it sounds like this is being affected in some way. I don't want to say it by an LFO because we're not there yet, but it sounds like something's affecting the sound more. It's not. It's just that this is several octaves below that sound, and I can have either, or I can mix them together. Now I'm going to have other stuff happening because as waves combine, I'm going to get weird stuff happening to the sound. I'm still not really doing anything else to it except that oscillator combination. Now this one's kind of cool because it can add in various step waves in random or sequenced patterns, or all random pulse width. Now you're probably thinking that this is supposed to be going like bum, 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 and it's not a sequencer in the fact that it's changing the pitch or putting a series of notes together. It's literally on this one note changing or randomizing that pulse width of this sub oscillator. Now this can also be turned off. This can also create noise. Noise generation is a thing that oscillators can do that can really make sounds interesting. A lot of percussion sounds are going to have noise generated in them. So I get a hit, but I also get like that snare kind of sound. And this one's kind of cool because I can also do an external source, which is allowable through the side chain. So that external source could be anything. Could be sampled music, could be your voice, could be a guitar, could be some other synthesizer. I could take Alchemy on a track and create some nice sound, and then I could use that as an external source to be the sub-oscillator to then take it through this whole process. Now when you start thinking about that, you start going, this is getting ridiculous. I'm already like way over my head because this has way too many options. So what you really have to do is take it down to those basic levels of sound generating by the oscillator, filter subtracts or takes part of that sound away. Amplifier is going to talk about the volume, and then we're going to talk a little bit about this Adsr and what that will do to this entire range of that sound. So for now, let's just stick with a wave, with just not the sub-oscillator. So we'll just take the oscillator. Let's move over to the filter. Cutoff, same thing, low pass filter. I'm reducing the highs. At some point I'm too low on my keyboard. Now I have a lot of highs in the pitch. I don't have a lot of lows, so as that goes lower, as that takes away all the highs, there's almost nothing there to hear. Resonance, remember, it emphasizes the sound, the frequencies around the cutoff of the filter. So let's raise that back up. This isn't going to have as crazy of a filtery sound. When resonance is high, you get that a lot more. Now those things can be controlled over time, but if we don't want to control that stuff over time, that's my sound. If I set them at one point and leave them, that's my sound. Normal kind of sound. I have this section in the middle for the filter. This, if you remember EQ, when we had this high pass or low pass filter, depending on which end we're on, if you noticed here, this part that I called the Q when we looked at EQ in classes before, the Q is the slope of the curve of EQ. And if you notice, when you have a high pass or low pass filter, it's set at a certain number of decibels per octave. The slope is steep or less steep depending on that number. And that's the exact same numbers that we're looking at here. Oops. In this 24, 24, 18, 12. That's the change in the slope of that low pass filter. So it's how drastic this cutoff is when we, oops, sorry, let's move that one back up. Come on. All right, there we go. Let's change that down. How that slope will change. Woo, man, it's jumping like crazy. So I have 12, 18, 24. I have those slopes on that EQ filter. It's the exact same thing. That's exactly what this is. And I can just change those slopes by clicking on those to change how I want them to be. You'll hear subtle differences. And there's classic and this says FET, which is just a different way of doing the math of that curve. Drive, how much can I drive this signal into that filter? So again, if we think of our signal flow as, in this case, left to right, the wave's been generated. Now I can add to that volume or not. Depending where my resonance and filter are, I may or may not hear as much as I... So you hear a little bit of differences there. Depending on how I have that set, you might hear different changes there. Again, velocity sensitivity, or where I play on the keyboard to say what, how will this sound so far that's come through this synth? How will this sound different as I play up and down the keyboard? Because if you think about playing on a keyboard, higher notes, lower notes have different timbres to them. If I tell the synthesizer, don't adjust for that normal change in how sounds sound to us. You play a trumpet, the lower sounds are going to have a different volume and a different timbre to them than the higher notes that you play. They may sound louder, they may sound softer. If I don't take that into account on a synth, they will all sound exactly the same, which in effect, my brain is going to sound like one end of the higher or the lower is going to sound unnatural. These are very similar. So I have a perception that something is going to be louder than another octave. Whereas if I use this key, see how the lower is so much different now? It's not sensitivity like how hard I press, it's that I'm in a lower octave and I want it to be adjusted for my normal kind of hearing of instruments, that in the lower ranges I'm not going to have as bright or as loud of a sound as I would in the higher registers. And I'm not hitting any harder. I have no velocity sensitivity on that whatsoever. Does this make sense? Are we lost? Okay. Okay, let's keep going. I never know because everyone's always so shy to say, I'm totally lost. We'll see how lost you are when we get back what we're going to do for this first assignment. And then we'll have time to kind of dissect it again. But I can talk till I'm blue in the face about what all this stuff does. Until you get in there and tweak it, you really don't get it. Okay, this says ADSR via velocity. We'll come back to this here. Amplifier. We know what this does. It's the volume of the sound going out of the synth. Very soft. very loud. Notice it can split, meaning I can have a difference between the velocities that I play, so that if I play a lighter velocity, let's make it really drastic. You almost hear nothing, but as I crank on that key, I hear more. So the amplifier can be controlled by velocity sensitivity, and that's what breaking that apart. Now I can set a range, and I can move the whole range together. You just got to kind of get used to how these things work. All right, lastly, for this synth, ADSR. What does that stand for? Awesome. Attack. How fast the sound starts. And notice on these sliders, attack, decay, release are timed. Right now they say short, long, but these are milliseconds, or depending on your synth, seconds or minutes. How fast or how slow does it take for that sound to start? To get to that maximum volume. Decay is a little less understood because I can have it get to that maximum volume, and then I can actually have it drop down to this sustained level. So let's do this. So you hear it slides up, hits the maximum, decreases to the level of S or sustain. And notice that sustain is not timed. It's either 0 or full, and that full correlates again to that exact full up here. So it could be a point where I have the decay is actually short and it increases, or is long and increases. It's a little harder to tell on this sound, but I can make it so the sound has a certain attack, gets to less than the maximum, and then jumps to that sustain so that it's louder. Release then is how I let go. So let's pull these back down. So I'm going to let go of the key now. And the release is long, so it takes longer for that sound to decay, to go away, I should say. Okay? Makes a lot of sense. Now, without all of our routing section, I want to show you this last part down here, which are the global parameters. Tuning. Yes, I'm generating here in my oscillators the sounds that I want to hear, but I can detune or uptune, make sharp, make flat, the actual instrument itself. So in relation to another instrument that would play. So maybe I have multiple instances of ES1, and I have the same exact sound, but I detune them so I can get the chorus effects. And then I could shift their attack on the second one a little bit, and I've got creating my own chorusing by myself without using any effects. Here's what I talked about early when you guys were talking about analog synths and how they would waver. The circuits might heat up, they might not work as perfectly as you think. At 0 analog, it's a pure digital instrument that never will waver. Whatever frequency I have this set at, and notice in this one I can't necessarily set it to a number, but whatever frequency is being created, it will not waver. But as I create more analog percentage, as I play over time, it's going to create differences between each note, between each register, between the filter, between the oscillator. It's going to randomize and detune the settings that I currently have set by whatever, magical computer number. And obviously I can go to 100%. So I'm starting to get a thicker sound because it's detuning and making it sound more. Hey, Kurt. So that will just kind of randomize some of those settings and detune things and make them not sound as, pleasurable. Pitch bend range, I can actually go a couple of octaves. Obviously, that's the pitch bend on your controller. Output level. Whatever level I set here is the output of the entire synth at that decibel level. That correlates directly to that scale. If I push that to full, it will only output at that level. It's not like a limiter, it's just kind of like a global amplifier. Voices, if you scroll through there, you can be monophonic to, on this one, 64 different voices of polyphony, which is a lot, but this is a pretty simple synth. You'll see that will change in different synths. So I can hold down all of them, and it will let it do that. And then legato will allow me to go through and play. There we go. Will allow me to go through and play, so it will jump from note to note like the glide did before. So it's only playing monophonically, but it's jumping down to that next note as soon as I hold down that next key. Ooh, now that one went away, but it was there before. Usually this room's pretty solid. And then chorus, C1, C2 ensemble. Remember that? We had that before. The only thing I didn't show you yet, because we are missing this whole section here, if you look up here.
Sorry.
That's okay. We have these 3 gate or volume buttons. ADSR means that this section right here will control the volume of this amplifier. So whatever I set here is going to work. A gate R means attack works, then it hits a volume, and then release works. But decay and sustain have no effect. No effect, really. You hear a little flutter, but that's not from this. It's probably because I have that still on.
I wonder why they let you change it.
I know. It shouldn't be doing anything. It should. What do you mean?
No, I mean like why don't you just leave it as ADSR and just, you know.
Like, why would you do attack and release? Well, if you want it simpler. If you
could just use ASR if you're not going to use the decay.
You could.
Yeah.
You could set that. I mean, setting it like this is in effect that. And then you also have gate R. So immediately I have, it's taking away the attack. My attack is immediate, so it's like attack being lower. I could see for like having, if I want to use it for other stuff.
Have it set like that.
Right, but I could also, if it did like filter controls, that might, it might help to keep the filter sweeping through this, but have the volume
goes up
not.
there just for the amp.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
because then this, I can use velocity sensitivity to have this affect filter.
That makes sense. So you gotta get W sound.
Thanks, Kurt. It's a lot, and I don't want you to get lost in how crazy this can be. And it's a little bit hard because I don't want to further complicate it by getting into the LFO and the routing and the mod envelope. If you go through here and you look at presets, so let's just go to like, things are going to be set in this area that we haven't talked about. So you're going to see things, and it's going to make sounds that maybe you're not used to, or that you don't know what's happening. So for this first assignment, I want you to create some sounds, and I would prefer that you take these off. So what I'm doing is making sure that the mod envelope is off, that these sliders that we'll talk about later are all the way down, that this oscillator rate is at 0, and that this glide is all the way down. So it doesn't matter what this is set to, because this is not doing anything. And I want you to play around with this and see what you can get. It's not bad to look at sounds and say, what are those like? how did they make them, but there'll be some pretty complicated ones in here, especially when you get into pads. I'm just holding down one key. It's like a sample and hold, which this doesn't have, but there's a reason why that's happening with that oscillator. Oh, we're not going to get to that yet. Questions about this so far? This ES1? Okay, I'm going to stop